This module presents the development of the aggregate expenditure model, what we're going to call the AE model. But before we do that, let's do one item of refresher here, and that is that the GDP, as measured by the expenditure approach, can be broken into four parts, right? GDP equals consumption, that's the biggest piece, investment, government spending, and net exports. Right? Those things sum up to equal GDP. Consumption is you and I spending money. Anytime you hand somebody cash, use a debit card or click on buy it now, that's consumption. Investment, don't think stocks and bonds. Investment is like infrastructure, right? When you build an apartment building or when you put a pool in your backyard or you and some other investors put a strip mall in your neighborhood, that's investment. Government spending is federal, state, and local governments buying things such as aircraft carriers or courthouses. And then net exports is our relationship with other countries, what we sell to them versus what we buy from them. The AE model aggregates these four forms of spending to find out where our economy would be in balance, what we call equilibrium. Right? So that's the expenditure approach for measuring GDP. There's other ways to measure GDP, but that's the one in my classes that we use. So the AE model, or primarily use. The AE model, don't be intimidated. AE, aggregate expenditures. Aggregate means to bring together. Expenditures is forms of spending. The aggregate expenditure model is simply a two-variable graph. And you got real GDP on this axis, and you got aggregate expenditures on this axis. And aggregate expenditures is just bringing all forms of spending together, C plus I plus G plus NX. Then you got this neat feature on the AE model, and that's a 45-degree line. This line bisects these two lines, cuts it in half. Okay, so all this line shows us is all the points where whatever variable here it's equal to the variable here. So just to give you a silly example, if this was 100 and then I bounced off of that, then I would know this would be 100. That's all that means. Right? Every point on there is going to be equal, whatever number this is going to be equal to the number on the y-axis. So the 45-degree line gives us that. Now to aggregate our four forms of expenditure, we need to pile them up, and I refer to it as making a sandwich. We need to pile them up. So let's start with investment. Okay, that's in green. Investment. Assume investment equals some amount. Maybe that's $50 billion in some hypothetical economy. I'm just grabbing this number out of thin air because I'm trying to aggregate all forms of spending. So maybe given this particular year with interest rates and everything that's going on, people that build strip malls and houses and other things, the total value of their spending is going to be $50 billion. That's regardless of GDP, so we have a straight line. Not a good assumption that this variable is not related to GDP, but it doesn't really hurt this model, so we make that assumption anyway. Government spending. Let's say that government spending this year is going to be $80 billion. Okay, so if that's $80 billion, well then government spending, regardless of GDP, government spending is going to be $80 billion, and when I sum these two up, I'm now at $130 billion, right? 50 plus $80 billion. So now I'm aggregating my expenditures, and I have I and I have G, and I know I have to add all three of them. GDP equals C plus I plus G plus NX. Let's turn our attention to this last one, net exports. Maybe net exports, we know it's negative in our country for the most part. Maybe it's positive in this country. Maybe it's going to be $20 billion, so I'm going to make that more narrow. That distance right there is $20 billion. And let's put that on net exports. And now, these three pieces combined are up to $150 billion, right? $150 billion, those three pieces combined, and then consumption. That's the last piece, and we got to be careful with this piece because we've assumed no relationship for all these three relative to GDP. That's why we have the straight lines. We can't possibly assume that for consumption. After all, real GDP is our income, and as our income goes up, I don't think I need to tell you we spend more money, we consume more. So we have to put a positive slope on consumption. In this model's, in practice in this model, it doesn't matter which variable has a slope on it as long as the overall model has a slope. More on that in a minute. So consumption, let's put a positive slope on consumption. As our income goes up, we spend more, and that's consumption. I'll put a C there. So if our income is very low, we might spend a little. If our income is very high, we might spend a lot. And that's that distance there. So we've now aggregated GDP. We've got our expenditures. We've got C plus I plus G plus NX. C plus I plus G plus NX. We've aggregated all those. So from there, we can draw a line right across the top of these four pieces, and we can call that AE, and that shows us our aggregated expenditures. And from there, we can erase all these colors because that's the line we're after. Give me 1 second to erase all these colors. There's our 45-degree line, okay? So this is what we're after, is this aggregate expenditure curve. And from here, what we see is that this point becomes pretty important. This point where the aggregate expenditure curve crosses over the 45-degree line becomes pretty important because this point, we refer to it as macroeconomic equilibrium. An economy is going to settle into that point. And I can demonstrate how that might work by giving you a couple of scenarios. So first of all, we know that whatever this number is, that's going to be the same number because it's on the 45-degree line. So let's call this 100 billion, right? Then we know this is 100 billion. And you might be saying, well, how do we know that the economy is going to arrive at this point? Let's do two scenarios. The first scenario, maybe real GDP is less than 100 billion. Maybe real GDP is 50 billion. In other words, we make $50 billion worth of output. $50 billion worth of stuff is produced in this economy. If that's true, we then hit the aggregate expenditure curve at that point. Okay? This is where 50 billion would be. This is where 50 billion occurs at this point right there. But we're not there. We're above that. So let's call that 70 billion. If it were here, it'd be 50 billion, but we're above that. We're up here at 70 billion. So let's see what's happening in this scenario. This economy has made $50 billion worth of stuff in output and purchased, the sum of all purchases, of all spending, is $70 billion. We bought $70 billion worth of stuff. We made $50 billion worth of stuff. In that case, inventories have got to be falling. We have bought more than we've made. So managers across the country walk out to the proverbial warehouse and they say to themselves, wow, my inventories are really low. I better do something to make sure I don't run out of stuff. I don't want to miss out on sales. So I'm going to hire some people. I'm going to turn on some assembly lines. I'm going to do whatever I have to do to increase the amount of output that I make. And that causes this point, right, where we're not at equilibrium, to drift in that direction. And that keeps happening until what we produce equals what we buy. So that's the low side scenario. Let's talk about the high side scenario. Here's 120 billion. Maybe that's how much output we make. At 120 billion, we hit the aggregate expenditure curve at this point, and maybe that's 110 billion. We know it's not 120 billion because for it to be 120 billion, it would have to be on the 45-degree line, which would be way up here. It's not up here, it's down here. So it's less than 120 billion. Let's call it 110 billion. So again, let's do a little analysis here. We produce $120 billion worth of stuff, but only $110 billion worth of stuff is purchased. So managers across the country now walk out to that same warehouse and they say, wow, there's a lot more stuff in here than I expected there to be. We made $120 billion worth of stuff, but people only bought $110 billion worth of stuff. My inventories are really starting to get big. So if that's true, they cut back on production, they lay some people off. Sad part of the story, they turn some assembly lines off and GDP falls, and this point drifts in that direction. So what we get is, because of inventory changes, we get this idea that an economy settles in on this point where the AE curve intersects with the 45-degree line. This point winds up being where an economy will eventually settle in, and you're going to see me use this point a lot when we develop the ISLM model.